Before we start week 5, let's look back at week 4. You are building sociological skills. Last week, we specifically looked at symbolic interaction as concepts. You learned about shared meaning, how groups create common understandings through interaction. We talked about front and backstage, public versus private behaviors, and what those mean. We also talked about social construction, how repeated interactions create social realities. Meaning making is the main idea here. It is the ongoing process of creating and maintaining social categories. These concepts are your foundation for understanding race as socially constructed. Last week, a lot of you did a lot of work. And specifically, I want to highlight one of your classmates' construction site observations and how it showed excellent analysis. They wrote Latino workers were usually doing heavy physical labor, while white workers were more often operating machinery or in supervisory roles. The language used reflected this too. Latino workers referred to as the muscle, and white workers were framed as the leaders. What made this analysis strong was it had specific observations about job divisions and language patterns. It applied the theory correctly, making shared meaning and front and backstage concepts, and it connected micro interactions to macro patterns. This is exactly the kind of sociological work we're doing. From week 5, now that we understand interactions, we're going to look at history, and we're going to figure together the big connection. So week 4, we talked about how racial meanings are created through daily interactions. But week 5, we're going to look at racial categories and how they were historically constructed through 3 articles, the Smedley's article, Fegan, and Decoder. Here is the bridge. The same meaning-making processes used, observed, and discussed in week 4 have been operating throughout history to create and maintain racial. This is today's lecture. Welcome to the lecture, which is an exploration of one of sociology's most important questions. How did race become such a powerful force in organizing human societies? Today we're going on a journey through time and across the globe to understand how something that feels so natural to many people is actually a human invention, and a fairly recent one at that. Our first chapter is Introduction to Race as a Sociological Concept. Here's what I want you to imagine as we start. You're sitting in a coffee shop and you look around and think you can easily see everyone's race. But what if I told you that if you transported that exact same group of people back to medieval England, those categories would not exist. The people would be the same, but the way of seeing them would be completely different. That's the puzzle we're solving today. How did we get from there to here? We're going to follow 3 brilliant sociological detectives. The Smedleys are our historians. They're going to show us the crime scene where race was invented. Fegan is our institutional analyst. He'll show us how racist ideas became woven into fabric of society. And Decoder is our global investigator. He'll show us how the same basic pattern plays out differently around the world. Each brings a different lens, but together they solve the mystery. These 2 researchers, and yes, they have the same last name, and that's because Audrey is Brian's mother. We're going to follow these brilliant detectives. The Smedleys, again, these are historians. And Fegan, again, is our institutional analyst. He's going to show us how the racist ideas became woven into the fabric of institutions, and Decoder is the one who goes globally. How does racism adapt to different cultures globally was his main question. Our story setting is the economic transformation in England, which helps us see Ireland as a racial laboratory. The Smedleys start our story in the 16th century England, and it's a story of radical transformation. Picture medieval England, and like in the upper left-hand corner, where people are tied to land, bound by kinship, everyone knowing their place in a hierarchy. But then capitalism comes roaring in like a hurricane. Suddenly everything is for sale, labor, land, even people themselves. The Smedleys introduced us to the concept called possessive individualism. The idea that you own yourself like property and society is basically a marketplace where everyone's buying and selling. Sounds reasonable, right? But here's the dark turn. If humans can be property, then some humans can own other humans. This isn't just about slavery. This is about creating the mental framework that makes racial slavery possible. But the Smedleys don't just give us theory, they show us a laboratory where racial thinking was tested, and that is here in Ireland. Picture the clash. All these are battles, and here they are all over the place. All these battles and this clash is between English people obsessed with property and permanent settlements, agricultural improvement. Irish people living as pastoralists, mobile, with their wealth in cattle, valuing freedom over fixed property. The English look at the Irish and think, what a waste! Look at all that good land and being trampled by cattle. The Irish look at the English and think, look at those poor souls trapped on tiny plots of dirt. These aren't just different lifestyles, they're incompatible worldviews. So the English create a new category, the savage, not just different, not just foreign, but fundamentally inferior, lazy, dirty, violent, incapable of civilization. And here's the crucial part. This is not just name calling. It becomes the justification for conquest, for taking land, for enslaving people. All of this area here is disputed, and this is where the fighting happened. The Smedleys show us that when the English crossed the Atlantic, they didn't have to invent racism. They just had to apply the Irish template to Native Americans and Africans. The Smedleys present Ireland as a laboratory where racial thinking was tested and refined. The clash between English agriculturalist and Irish pastoralist is used to illustrate the incompatible worldviews. The English perceived the Irish as savages, a category that justified conquest and subjugation. This narrative demonstrates how racial categories were not merely descriptive but served political and economic purposes. There are parallels between the treatment of the Irish and later colonial practices in the Americas, showing how the savage template was applied to Native Americans and Africans. This section underscores the intentional strategic construction of racial hierarchies. Now Fegan takes us from the origins of that to persistence. He asks, if race was invented in the 1600s, why are we still dealing with it today? His answer is brilliant and troubling. It's not just in people's heads anymore. It's become what he calls a white racial frame that operates like operating systems of a society. The next few chapters in the story will show us exactly how that goes. Think about your computer's operating system. You don't see it, but it's running everything. That's what Fegan shows us about racism. It's not just the obvious stuff, the slurs, the discrimination. It's the underlying framework that shapes how we see everything, how we remember history, how we interpret current events, and how we imagine the future. And here's the really important part. It operates at every level simultaneously. Individual thoughts, group dynamics, institutional policies. So even when we change laws, even when people's conscious attitudes improve, the deeper framework keeps reproducing this racial inequality. It's like trying to fix a computer by changing the wallpaper while the operating system keeps running the same programs. The next part we're going to go to is backstage versus front stage racism. Often, people think of life as a theater, what is going on in the front and what is going on in the back. We've discussed this before with Goffman. Fegan's work is about backstage versus front stage racism. The clip to the left, if you were to follow it, is Diversity Day at the office. And what Fegan focused on was doing exactly this. What is upstage, front in front, and what is backstage? Identifying rituals that reinforce hierarchies. like private racist jokes and performances that act as rituals that sustain and teach racial hierarchies and cultural norms. As one of his evidences, he used a journal from a student. In that journal, you can picture a white college student. They're probably even like people you'd recognize. They seem normal in public, maybe even progressive, but when they're alone together, the mask comes off. Elaborate racist jokes, songs mocking different groups, and performances that would just make your skin crawl. Unfortunately, this is not just boys being boys. This is how racial culture reproduces itself. In the backstage moments, they're not just telling jokes, they're practicing racial hierarchy. They're teaching each other how to be white in a racialized society. And the student writing the journal, he is uncomfortable as he identifies this, but he does not speak up. That silence is part of the system too. If you'd like to see some front stage action that is supposed to be backstage, which makes this clip funny, go ahead and look up Diversity Day for The Office. Here's one of Fegan's most powerful insights. Societies don't just have racism, they have racist memories. He interviews older white Southerners about segregation, and they remember it as a time of good racial relations. One person says there was a place for blacks and there's a place for whites, but they were not mistreated. Think about that for a moment. Legal segregation, lynching, economic exclusion, remembered as good relations. And this is not lying. It's the racial frame doing its work. It filters memory, keeping the parts that make white people look good and forgetting the parts that reveal the violence and oppression. And these sanitized memories get passed down to the next generation, making current inequality seem natural. Fegan's main takeaways here is that societies often remember and forget events to shape a preferred historical narrative that supports their worldview. This is the selective memory in society. We have romanticized the Jim Crow era, as some memories portray segregation as a period of good racial relations, reflecting a sanitized and distorted past. He also uses the white racial frame impact. This frame filters memories to protect a positive self-image and justifies ongoing racial inequalities. And the importance of critical examination is what he highlights a lot, because critically analyzing historical narratives is essential to understanding and challenging systemic racism. And we move on now to the global variations in racial constructions with Decoder. Decoder takes us global and shows us something fascinating. Racism spreads everywhere, but it does not look the same everywhere. He calls this the interactive model. It's not just Europeans imposing their racial ideas on everyone else. Local cultures take these ideas and reshape them according to their own traditions and needs. His insight is crucial for sociology. Human beings are not passive recipients of ideas. They're active agents who take global forces and adapt them to local conditions. So while racial thinking spreads globally, it creates different patterns in different spaces. Here's a perfect example of how it works. We often think Europeans showed up and called Native Americans red, but Dakota shows research revealing that many southeastern tribes were already calling themselves red people. It's connected to their origin stories, their spiritual beliefs, and their understanding of their place in the world. When Europeans arrived calling themselves white, Native Americans didn't just accept European categories. They adapted their own existing framework. Red versus white made sense within the Native cosmology. The tragedy is how this indigenous framework got twisted into a hierarchy that justified conquest and genocide. The same pattern happened in China. Yellow was not a European imposition. It was already the imperial color, the color of the center, the color of nobility. When Chinese intellectuals encountered European racial theories in 1890s, they didn't just copy them. They took their own positive associations with yellow and created a modern racial identity around being the descendants of the yellow emperor. This shows how racial categories aren't just imposed from the outside. They succeed best when they connect to existing cultural meanings. It's a reminder that racialization is always a collaborative process, even when the outcomes are oppressive. Now here's Dakota's most powerful insight, and it connects all of our stories together. He asks, why did racial thinking explode in the modern era? His answer, equality. He asks, why did racial thinking explode in the modern era? And he says, equality? What is that? But think about it. In medieval times, hierarchy was natural. Kings ruled by divine right. Peasants accepted their station, and everyone knew inequality was just how the world worked. But then came enlightenment, democracy, and the idea that all men are created equal. And suddenly you have a problem. How do you maintain inequality in a society that believes in equality? You need a new justification. Religion won't work anymore. People can convert. Culture won't work, but can because people can learn new cultures. But biology seems permanent, unchangeable, natural. And race provides the perfect solution to this modern dilemma. It says, yes, we believe in equality for people who are equally human, but these others, they're biologically different. It's a brilliant and evil adaptation to egalitarian ideals. And this is where all three scholars converge. The power of scientific language. Whether it's English writers describing Irish savagery, American researchers measuring skulls, or Chinese scientists proving Han racial superiority, they all appeal to science for legitimacy. But Dakota shows us something crucial. There is not one science speaking with one voice. Science is diverse, complex, and contradictory. So racists can always find some scientific theory to support whatever hierarchy they want to create. The specific science changes, from skull measurements to genetics to DNA, but the function remains the same, making social inequality seem natural and inevitable. So let's bring our three detectives together. What have they solved for us? First, the medleys show us that race is socially constructed under specific historic conditions. It's not natural, it's not inevitable. It emerges when particular economic and political forces create the need for new forms of inequality. Second, Fegan shows us how these constructed categories became institutionally embedded. They get built into the structure of society so deeply that they reproduce themselves even when people's conscious attitudes change. And third, Dakota shows us that while this pattern is global, it is not uniform. Different societies create different racial systems adapted to their own cultural context and political needs. Taken together, we know we have these ingredients: the social construction of race, institutional embedding, the global variation with similar functions. And now we will focus on the importance for an inequality analysis. Understanding these insights is essential for analyzing social inequalities and imagining alternative futures. In plain terms, race is socially constructed, race becomes institutionally embedded, race varies globally while serving similar functions. Why does this matter for you as sociology students? Because it gives you the tools to understand why racial inequality persists even after legal changes, why different societies have different experiences with race, and most importantly, why change is possible. This next series of slides is to identify how relevant this information is and how relevant sociology is to students. Remember, if race were biological, we'd be stuck with it. We do have inequality. For example, when we think about health and healthcare for Black people in the US, 41 million people, or 13% of the US population, are Black, with higher shares in the South. Addressing disparities in their health and healthcare is key for supporting and improving the wealth and health well-being of Black families. For example, Black people have higher rates of illness and death compared to white people. This social construction is not just about health, it's about other things too, such as completing university programs. White students are, on average, about 60% complete university program when they enter into it. Less so is true for Black students, more than 45%, and less than 40% of Hispanic students start university but don't end it. It's not just about health, it's not just about education, it's also about policing. Black people are disproportionately stopped on the street by police, while white people are much more likely to call the police for help. So the relevance to sociology students is that we need to understand the persistence of inequality, recognize variation in solutions, and see the possibility for change. You're leaving today with a sociological toolkit. When you encounter racial issues in the news, in your community, in your own life, the sociologist prompts you to ask, what are the historical roots of this? How is this embedded in institutions? How do other societies handle this differently? These aren't just academic questions, they are tools for understanding and potentially changing the world around you. So, just so you know, I'm going to describe the sociological detective activity a little bit more in detail. So it's your turn to be the detective. You need to choose one of the three patterns. I suspect you will probably need about 45 minutes, 30 minutes to get started, and 15 minutes to finish. It's still worth the 30 points, and it's due by midnight on Sunday, which happens to be the 21st. Remember, you've learned the theories. Now let's see. I want to make sure you understand why this activity matters. I specifically want you to connect sociological theory to your world. Smedley, Fegan, and DeCoter studied historical examples. You, however, will apply their detective work to contemporary media. So the goal is to discover how racial construction happens all around us, not just in those history books. The same patterns that these scholars found centuries ago are still operating today, if you can find them. So as a quick reminder, here are your three different perspectives and what you're going to be looking for. Choose one framework. If you choose the Smedleys, which is the economic construction, you'll be asking questions like, how do economic systems create racial categories? The evidence you'll be looking for is who benefits? What jobs do people have? How does money or power shape relationships? If you choose detective number 2, which is the Fegan institutional embedding, you'll ask questions about how do racial ideas become embedded in systems. So in that case, you should look for rules, policies, backstage versus front stage behaviors, and quote unquote normal procedures. If you would prefer, you could also look at detective number 3, which is DeCoter's cultural adaptation, which says, how do cultures adapt to racial categories? In this case, you'd be looking for local symbols, traditions, and cultural meanings giving to race. Media examples are pretty easy to come across, and any media works. Examples from past students have been traditional media, Disney movies, Netflix shows, even music videos. Also in social media, TikTok trends, Instagram algorithms, and dating apps. Some of those were fascinating. But there's also everyday examples. For example, McDonald's commercials, campus dining, or even job websites while you're looking for work. And also gaming, character creation, storylines, online communities. They're all examples that you could use. For example, if somebody were choosing to be a Fegan detective, and McDonald's says, the McDonald's I'm Lovin' It ad shows happy families and friends, but what racial assumptions are embedded in their definition of normal families? What's backstage versus front stage in their marketing? So the key here is I want you to pick something you can discuss with specific details, keeping in mind which framework you're looking at. To help you set up for success, I thought I might put out a timeline and see how you all like it. This is designed to be manageable. Step 1 should take about 5 minutes, where you just choose which one of the 3 ways you're going to look at it and your media. You could just use a dartboard if you want to, or pull a number out of a hat. Step 2, or of course choose one that you feel most familiar with. Step 2, which should take about 10 minutes, is to actually look at the media and look around and find 2 or 3 specific examples. Step 3 is to write a couple of paragraphs, perhaps 200 to 250 words. I am not counting. I just need you to get your ideas down, but that should take you about 15 minutes. As always, I am here to support you. Inside of the discussion board, there are examples if you're having a hard time coming up with something. Zootopia is there, if you're familiar with that movie. It's about, you could view animal species as a racial metaphor. Black Panther could look at African identity and colonial themes. Hamilton had some interesting casting choices and historical reframing. And there's that Netflix show, The Good Place, where merit systems had an institutional bias. So review the activity instructions for the guided questions. That could also help. And remember, there is no single right answer. It's what you think might be the answer, and it's the time to discuss it. That's the reason we have responses on the discussion board. You've got the tools, and I'm sure that you'll be able to discover something fascinating. You've got this. So to do by Wednesday, you need to take your exam number 1. This exam is based on previous lecture quizzes. They are literally the same questions. You have an unlimited time, unlimited attempts, and also it is open book, open everything. The whole point of this unit exam is to look back to what we've already gone over and to identify where we are going. I will tell you that the multiple choice questions are really very smally. They're worth 1 point each. There are a few fill in the blank answers which are worth 5 points, but there are some short answer questions that you have seen before and have had responses from me, especially if I would encourage you to look at the questions in your quizzes and look at any comments I may have made about them afterwards. Those questions are worth 20 points. It is a beautiful time to stop, take a look back, and so that we can move forward with a really strong understanding. That is the point of exam 1. Also, because we have exam 1, there is no lecture quiz this week. So you should finish that by Wednesday. Also, please review this lecture by Wednesday. And remember, the lecture always has all the material you need to be able to complete this week's learning objectives and activities. And then due by Sunday is to complete the discussion board. I hope you have an excellent week. Remember, I have office hours on Wednesday if you need them.